December 3, 2025, and a disturbing update has emerged about one of the most infamous serial killers in American history. Multiple insiders now claim that Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer, is quietly entering the final stage of his life inside Washington State Penitentiary. But what almost no one realizes is what these last 2 decades have actually looked like for him, and why many say the punishment he received may be far more brutal than any execution could ever be. Most assume that life behind bars is a softer outcome, a merciful alternative to death. But what if the truth is the exact opposite? What if Ridgway has endured something far worse than lethal injection? Stay with me, because what you're about to learn will force you to rethink everything you thought you knew about justice. November 30th, 2001, marked the end of a decades-long chase when detectives quietly waited outside a truck factory near Seattle. As Gary Ridgway stepped out of the building after his shift, they moved in. For almost 20 years, Ridgway had managed to evade law enforcement while bodies of young women continued to appear along the Green River and scattered throughout King County, Washington. The investigation into these disappearances had ballooned into one of the largest and most expensive in the history of the United States. Officers worked tirelessly, chasing every lead, but it wasn't until the emergence of a new technology, DNA testing, that they were finally able to link him to crimes committed in the early 1980s. Science had caught what human observation could not, and the net finally closed. But capturing Ridgway was only the beginning. His knowledge held the key to answers that grieving families had been seeking for decades. King County prosecutors faced a moral and legal crossroads in 2003. They could pursue the death penalty and risk a lengthy and expensive trial that might culminate in execution, or they could negotiate a deal. The families of the victims had already endured years without closure, and Ridgway was the only person who could provide them with crucial information. The offer was clear: reveal the locations of the victims, and the death penalty would be taken off the table. November 5, 2003, arrived, and the courtroom was filled with tension. Ridgway, standing before the judge, submitted a written statement that would shock even seasoned legal professionals. He admitted to a horrifying number of murders, 48 confirmed victims, though he later claimed the total was closer to 71. The judge sentenced him to 49 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, a sentence confirmed by the discovery of a 49th victim in 2011. Outrage rippled through the public. Many demanded execution. Yet, what most people failed to grasp was that death, swift and terminal, would have been far easier than the punishment awaiting him behind prison walls. Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla, colloquially known as the Walls, had been operational since 1887. When Ridgway arrived in January 2004, he became instantly recognizable, a living symbol of terror within the facility. Other inmates knew his crimes, and with that notoriety came real danger. Correctional specialists warned that Ridgway could be targeted by relatives of victims or other prisoners seeking notoriety through violence. His presence in the general population posed a security nightmare. Officials had little choice. He was assigned to restrictive housing to ensure his survival. Restrictive housing, according to the Washington State Department of Corrections, involves isolating certain inmates from the general population in highly controlled environments, often in single-occupancy cells. Ridgway reportedly spent 23 hours a day locked in his cell, with only a single hour permitted for exercise. Social interactions were strictly prohibited. This was not a temporary measure. It became his reality for over 2 decades. Imagine the monotony and mental strain. Waking up in a concrete cell approximately 80 square feet in size, akin to a small bathroom, furnished only with a steel bed, a toilet, and a sink. The walls and floor were cold, gray, and unchanging. Meals were eaten alone. Exercise was solitary. The only human contact came from guards, who monitored his movements with rigid precision. 23 hours in such conditions is not just time. It is a slow erosion of human connection, a constant reminder of isolation. Yet, this was only the beginning. May 2015 brought an unusual development that revealed the depths of his confinement. Prison documents, leaked to reporters, painted a detailed picture. Ridgway had followed all rules, never breaking regulations, but records also noted complaints of mental health issues, including prolonged stress and medication usage. In response, officials made a controversial and costly decision. He was transferred to a maximum security federal prison in Colorado. The transfer cost nearly $20,000, involving private air travel. The rationale was that Ridgway, less known in Colorado, might be able to integrate into the general population, access work programs, and enjoy minimal privileges not possible in Walla Walla. The move ignited outrage. Former King County Sheriff Dave Riker, who had overseen the Green River Task Force, described the decision as an affront to the victims' families. Prosecutors involved in the original case were blindsided, learning of the transfer only through media reports. Yet, the decision revealed the severity of his prior conditions. Prison officials were willing to expend significant resources to mitigate the psychological impact of decades in near-total isolation. The experiment lasted only 5 months. Public outcry, combined with pressure from Washington state officials, forced Ridgway back to Walla Walla in October 2015. The justification: ongoing murder investigations required his proximity. Once again, he was confined to restrictive housing, and once again, he resumed the monotonous cycle of isolation. Fast forward nearly a decade, and another perplexing development emerged. In September 2024, Ridgway was unexpectedly moved from Walla Walla to King County Jail in Seattle. The move was shrouded in secrecy. The court order was sealed until March 2025, leaving families and the public puzzled. Why transport him after so many years? When the documents were unsealed, the explanation came. Ridgway had indicated he could assist in locating additional victims, but claimed he could not provide accurate information from his cell. Investigators needed to bring him to the sites themselves. A multi-day search operation was organized, with Ridgway, now 75, guiding law enforcement to alleged burial locations around King County. Extensive searches yielded nothing. No bones, no evidence, no confirmation of his claims. Some investigators suspect he fabricated the locations, seizing a rare opportunity for a brief reprieve from confinement. After more than 20 years in restrictive housing, he was still asserting control, still manipulating the environment to his advantage. Even decades of isolation had not dulled his calculated nature. Former prosecutors offered insights into his psychology. During interrogations in 2003 to 2004, Patty Eakes noted his limited intellectual capacity but also a remarkable ability to manipulate. Ridgway described his murders with shocking detachment, framing strangulation as his career, recounting events with no apparent remorse. Most victims were strangers, chosen opportunistically rather than by design. Eakes observed a disturbing charm, a disarming demeanor that may have contributed to his ability to gain trust over years of predation. Yet, his confessions were partial. Many horrific acts had to be extracted. He volunteered nothing, revealing a persistent pattern of concealment and control. The question arises, did decades of solitary confinement affect him as it would any other person? Or did his psychological makeup render him largely impervious to the mental collapse typically associated with prolonged isolation? The answer remains uncertain. Meanwhile, the human cost persisted. Families of 3 women, Cassie Lee, Kimberly Nelson, and Tracy Winston, still live without closure, decades after their disappearances in the early 1980s. Despite Ridgway's confessions, not all remains have been recovered, leaving relatives to cope with uncertainty, without graves to visit, without tangible evidence of closure. Even as Ridgway ages, he retains this grim leverage over their lives. This ongoing tension underscores the controversy surrounding the plea deal. Some argue it was necessary to recover victims and provide a measure of peace. Others contend that execution, though final, might have been the only just response. No simple answer exists. The ethical and legal debate continues to haunt prosecutors, families, and the public alike. By December 1, 2025, reports emerged that Ridgway, now 76, was receiving end-of-life care. While the Washington Department of Corrections officially denied significant changes in his health, independent sources suggest otherwise. Journalistic investigations dating back to 2019 already noted declining health, ongoing medication use, and mental strain. Over 21 years in restrictive housing with minimal human interaction and limited physical activity had taken a visible toll. The contrast between execution and decades of solitary confinement becomes stark when examined objectively. Death row involves limited yet present human contact, attorneys, family visits, last meals, final statements. It concludes within a predictable time frame. Ridgway's experience, by contrast, has stretched indefinitely. Over 7,600 days and more than 182,000 hours in near-total isolation. He has endured constant recognition, hatred from other inmates, and the gradual deterioration of mental faculties. No end date, no ritual closure, just endless gray walls and silence until biology intervenes. The psychological impact of prolonged solitary confinement has been studied extensively. Research indicates severe consequences: hallucinations, intense anxiety, depression, emotional instability, and even permanent cognitive impairment. The United Nations has declared extended isolation, more than 15 days, as a potential form of torture. Ridgway, having endured over 21 years in near-total isolation, stands as an extreme example of these effects. Yet, his case is complicated by the nature of his psyche. He is a man who strangled 49 confirmed victims, possibly more than 70, without remorse, who described killing as a career, and who demonstrated remarkable emotional detachment. Can someone with such a mind experience suffering in the way ordinary humans do? Or does he simply mark time until biology claims him? Experts remain divided. Prison officials and criminologists offer contrasting perspectives. Some argue that his repeated complaints about mental health, along with documented medication use, indicate a clear psychological toll. Others contend that Ridgway's fundamental detachment may shield him from the deep suffering that isolates most inmates. What is undeniable is that he lived an existence no human should endure. His daily routine, waking in the same gray cell, eating in silence, exercising alone, and having only guards for human interaction, represents a slow erosion of the human spirit. Decades of this monotony may warp perception, distort reality, and accelerate mental decline, even in those already emotionally detached. The 2015 Colorado transfer highlights this complexity. Officials spent tens of thousands of dollars to relocate Ridgway, hoping a change in environment would allow some normalcy. The plan was simple: place him in a population of inmates who did not know him, allow access to limited programs, and monitor his adjustment. The experiment was brief, 5 months, but it illuminated the severity of the isolation he had endured for over 11 years at that point. Ridgway was quickly returned to Walla Walla, reinforcing the notion that even limited attempts to normalize his confinement were met with logistical and public obstacles. The experiment confirmed the profound psychological impact of his prior incarceration. Officials had to intervene to preserve some measure of mental stability. Beyond his mental state, Ridgway maintained a chilling grip over others. He still controlled information about missing victims, leveraging decades-old secrets to assert influence. Even at 75, during the 2024 search operations in King County, he manipulated law enforcement, potentially fabricating burial sites just to leave the confines of his cell. This reveals a constant need for control, an unyielding psychological pattern that persisted despite the harshest conditions imaginable. His mind, hardened by years of crime and isolation, continued to operate with the same cold calculation that characterized his murders. The families of his victims lived under a shadow of uncertainty that decades of incarceration could not lift. 3 young women, Cassie Lee, Kimberly Nelson, and Tracy Winston, remain missing, their families deprived of closure. Over 40 years later, no graves exist, no definitive locations to visit, no evidence to hold. Ridgway's secrecy perpetuates suffering, proving that even extreme punishment cannot undo the devastation he caused. His plea deal, necessary to recover some remains contentious. Some view it as pragmatic, others see it as morally troubling. Either way, the ethical debate surrounding Ridgway's punishment persists as Ridgway reportedly nears the end of his life. The contrast between his fate and a typical death row scenario becomes even more stark. Execution, though final, offers predictability. Legal representation, potential family visits, last meals, final statements, and closure within hours. Ridgway's experience offers none of these elements. Over 182,000 hours in restrictive housing, watched constantly, isolated completely, with the endless repetition of gray walls, concrete floors, and cold steel fixtures. This is the reality he has endured. Time stretches indefinitely, measured not by calendars but by the monotony of a confined existence. Each day is a mirror of the last, each hour reinforcing isolation, each minute confirming the absence of human connection. The very structure of solitary confinement amplifies suffering. Cells are small, typically 80 square feet, and devoid of sensory variation. Meals are delivered in silence, exercise occurs in small concrete yards alone, and the only interaction comes from guards performing routine checks. For the average person, this level of deprivation would be psychologically devastating. Emotions can fray, perception can distort, and memory can shift in response to the sensory monotony. But Ridgway's mind presents a unique case. With a history of extreme emotional detachment, a pattern of manipulation, and decades of calculated criminal behavior, he may experience this punishment differently. Still, evidence of mental decline and reliance on medication suggests that even the most hardened criminals are not immune to the effects of prolonged isolation. The broader implications of his case extend beyond Ridgway himself. It raises questions about justice, punishment, and human endurance. Can society impose sentences designed to cause mental suffering without crossing moral lines? Is life in perpetual isolation more severe than execution? Ridgway's circumstances challenge conventional notions of punishment. Life behind walls of concrete, alone for 23 hours a day for over 2 decades, has been described by experts as worse than death. In execution, a person faces an immediate, final end. In restrictive housing, there is no resolution, only the endless passage of time measured against gray walls and silence. Public debate has followed Ridgway's confinement for years. Some argue that justice was served by ensuring he could not harm anyone else while also recovering critical information about victims. Others argue that execution would have been simpler, providing swift finality rather than decades of isolation. The ethical tension lies in balancing the needs of justice with the realities of punishment. Ridgway's experience shows that the state can impose a sentence far harsher than death itself, a punishment extended over decades, requiring neither trial nor execution, yet exacting a profound psychological cost. Despite the harsh conditions, Ridgway continued to exert influence and control, demonstrating the adaptability of his criminal mind. During the 2024 search operations, he attempted to manipulate law enforcement, creating uncertainty, extending his influence, and asserting his relevance even in the final years of his life. These actions highlight the complex interplay between environment and psychology. Isolation, even extreme isolation, does not necessarily strip power from someone like Ridgway. It may instead amplify his ability to calculate, scheme, and manipulate in subtle ways. Ultimately, the story of Gary Ridgway is a disturbing testament to the intersection of crime, punishment, and human psychology. He has lived for over 2 decades in conditions that would break the average person, yet his mind remains engaged in manipulation and control. His story challenges assumptions about justice, morality, and the limits of human endurance. As of December 2025, the man is aging, potentially declining, yet the lessons of his imprisonment, the consequences of extreme isolation, the limits of the human psyche, and the enduring moral questions surrounding justice remain profoundly relevant when we consider the choices made by prosecutors, the strategy of restrictive housing, and the ethical implications of prolonged confinement. One fact stands out. Ridgway's punishment has been extraordinary. He has endured a sentence that is both invisible and relentless, a slow, grinding torment measured in decades rather than minutes. This raises questions that society may never fully answer. The balance between justice, rehabilitation, and humane treatment is delicate and often subjective. Yet Ridgway's life in prison exemplifies how the system can impose a fate more harrowing than death. In the end, his story forces reflection. How do we reconcile the need for justice with the ethical treatment of even the most reviled individuals? What constitutes punishment for those who show no remorse and have caused immense harm? And, perhaps most chillingly, can anyone truly comprehend the psychological cost of decades in restrictive housing until they have lived it themselves? Gary Ridgway's existence behind the gray walls of Walla Walla is more than punishment. It is a cautionary tale about the profound consequences of crime, the limits of the human mind, and the ethical boundaries of justice. What we can say with certainty is this: the victims had no choice, no chance to negotiate, no time to process what was happening. They died terrified, alone, and with their lives stolen before they could truly live them. Many were young women, just beginning to navigate the world, with futures that were abruptly erased. Their families have lived with unimaginable grief, uncertainty, and unanswered questions, serving a life sentence of their own in loss and despair. Meanwhile, Ridgway lived 76 years, experiencing the freedom to work, marry, and even have a child before his crimes were exposed. And after that, he spent 21 additional years in restrictive housing, alive, confined, and enduring the slow passage of time. Whether those 2 decades behind concrete walls represent a punishment worse than execution is something only you can decide. I've laid out the facts as clearly and thoroughly as possible. Gary Ridgeway has spent over 21 years in extreme isolation at Washington State Penitentiary, locked in his cell for 23 hours a day, with minimal human contact and no realistic chance of release. His mental health has been documented as deteriorating, and now, at 76, he is reportedly approaching the end of his life. The victims and their families never had the options he did. This raises a difficult question. Is life in prolonged isolation a more severe punishment than death? Some argue that decades of sensory deprivation, constant solitude, and gradual decline in mind and body are far harsher than a quick execution. Others maintain that execution is the only just response to crimes of this magnitude, and that allowing him to live at all was an act of mercy too great for someone like Ridgway. I want to know what you think after hearing all of this. Do you believe his 21 years in restrictive housing were worse than the death penalty would have been? Or do you think justice would have been better served had he been executed back in 2003? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. This isn't just about one man or one case. It's a reflection on how society chooses to punish its worst offenders and whether any form of justice can truly fit crimes this severe. As of today, Gary Ridgway remains in custody at Washington State Penitentiary. Whether he is dying now or merely aging within the confines of restrictive housing, his story will eventually end. But the stories of his 49 victims ended decades ago, without choice, without mercy, without justice. I'll ask you one final time. After seeing what 21 years in a concrete cell really means, do you still believe execution is the ultimate punishment? Or is there something far worse than death? Your answer matters because it shapes how we hold the worst criminals accountable. If this perspective changed the way you think, hit that like button and subscribe for more in-depth explorations into criminal justice and the consequences of crime. Remember the victims, question the system,